Today, we are going back to the year 1869 to the story of Jabari, a giant African hunter boy whose presence and abilities stunned the American South and stirred fear, wild rumors, and a mystery no one could ever fully explain. This is a heavy and intense story, so take a moment, breathe slowly, and listen closely. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which city and country you are listening from. Your support helps keep these stories alive instead of lost and forgotten. Let us begin. In the summer of 1869, on a cotton plantation 40 miles west of New Orleans, a group of wealthy white men gathered for what they proudly called a sporting event. They arrived with rifles, bottles of whiskey, and dogs trained to hunt escaped slaves. They came to witness a spectacle that their host, Colonel Marcus Whitmore, promised would be unlike anything they had ever seen before. The prey, Whitmore announced with dramatic flair, would be an African giant, a savage captured from the deepest jungles of the Congo. He was described as a creature more beast than man, meant to provide thrilling sport before being killed like the animal they believed him to be. What happened over the next 48 hours would turn into legend across Louisiana, but not the kind of legend Whitmore had imagined. By the time the sun rose on the third day, 3 of the hunters were dead. 7 more were wounded so badly that they would never fully heal. Colonel Marcus Whitmore himself was discovered tied to a cypress tree deep in his own swamp, crying and begging for mercy, surrounded by every enslaved person he had brutalized for years. The African giant was gone. He vanished into the wilderness along with 43 men, women, and children who should have been free 4 years earlier, but were kept in chains through lies, violence, and the deliberate blindness of a nation that had grown tired of fighting for justice. This is the true story of Jabari, the hunter who became the hunted and then became the hunter once again. It is a story of survival and revenge, of courage and intelligence, of a man underestimated by everyone who encountered him, and who made them pay for that mistake in ways they could never have imagined. The story does not begin in Louisiana, but 6,000 miles away in a village along the banks of the Congo River in the autumn of 1868. The village had existed in the same place for more than 300 years. The people who lived there were part of the Congo Kingdom, one of the most advanced civilizations in Central Africa, with a written language, an organized system of government, and trade networks that stretched across the continent. They were farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and scholars, warriors and priests. They had endured Portuguese colonization, survived centuries of slave raids that reduced their population, and resisted constant pressure from neighboring kingdoms seeking to expand their land. Jabari was born in 1852, the 3rd son of a man named Ken, who held the respected title of war chief. In the village hierarchy, this made Jabari part of royalty, though he was not destined to rule. His older brothers would inherit their father's duties. Jabari's path was different. From the age of 7, he was trained as a hunter. This training was serious and demanding. Among the Congo people, hunters held a special place in society. They provided food for the community, protected the village from dangerous animals, and traveled deep into the wilderness, learning its secrets and dangers. A skilled hunter was often more valuable than many warriors because he could survive alone, endure harsh conditions, and succeed through patience and intelligence rather than brute strength. Jabari excelled in this training. By the time he was 12, he had killed his first leopard, tracking it for 3 days through thick jungle before cornering it in a ravine and killing it with a single spear strike. At 14, he confronted a forest elephant that was destroying nearby farms, driving the massive animal away using fire, noise, and careful positioning that showed a tactical mind far beyond his age. By 16, he was considered one of the finest hunters in the region, requested by neighboring villages to handle dangerous animals, and consulted by his father on matters of strategy and defense. By any standard, Jabari was physically extraordinary. He stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, a height remarkable anywhere in the world and nearly unheard of in the mid-19th century, when the average man stood closer to 5 feet 6 inches. His body was packed with muscle shaped by years of running through forests, climbing trees, and carrying heavy loads across rough terrain. His shoulders were so broad he often had to turn sideways to enter doorways. His hands were large enough to span a grown man's skull. Yet what truly made Jabari formidable was not his size, but his mind. He inherited his father's gift for strategy. the ability to see situations from multiple angles, to predict an opponent's actions before they happened, and to plan several moves ahead while appearing to act on instinct alone. This skill served him well in hunting, where the difference between life and death often depended on anticipating how an animal would respond under pressure. It would serve him even better in Louisiana, where the creatures he hunted walked on two legs and believed themselves masters of the world. Jabari's capture took place in October of 1868. By then, the Atlantic slave trade had been illegal for decades. The United States had banned slave importation in 1808, and Britain had spent vast resources patrolling the African coast to stop slave ships. International pressure forced most European nations to abandon the trade, but laws written on paper did not always match reality. After the American Civil War, with the federal government focused on rebuilding the nation and integrating 4 million formerly enslaved people, opportunists saw a chance to profit. Labor was still desperately needed in the Deep South, and there were always men willing to break the law if the reward was high enough. A group of investors based in New Orleans created a smuggling network that moved captured Africans through Cuba, where Spanish officials could be bribed, and then into the Louisiana bayous along routes that avoided federal patrols. The operation was small, bringing in only a few hundred people each year, but it was profitable enough to attract powerful backers and serious protection. The capture team that entered Jabari's region included 12 men, a mix of Portuguese traders, Arab middlemen, and African collaborators from rival tribes. They had been active for months, targeting isolated farms and small settlements while avoiding larger villages that could fight back. Jabari's village was too large to attack directly, so the team waited and watched, searching for weakness. They found it in Jabari's younger sister, Amara. Amara was 15 years old, beautiful, and like many teenagers, sometimes wandered farther from the village than she should have. She had a favorite place near a waterfall 2 miles from the village, where she went to think and escape the pressure of being the war chief's daughter. The capture team took her on a Tuesday afternoon. When Jabari learned what had happened, he acted immediately. He tracked the captors through the forest, reading signs others would never notice, and moving faster than men slowed by prisoners. He caught them at their camp 12 miles away just as the sun was setting. He could have attacked, armed with his spear and knife, confident he could kill several before being overwhelmed. But Amara was tied to a tree in the center of the camp, a knife held to her throat by a man ready to use it. The leader of the group, a Portuguese trader named Heir, offered Jabari a choice: surrender and Amara would be freed, fight, and she would die before he reached her. Jabari looked at his sister, at the blade, and at the 12 armed men waiting eagerly for profit. He dropped his spear. Heir kept his promise in part. Amara was released and given several hours to flee before anyone followed her. She made it back to the village and told her father what had happened. Search parties were sent out, but by then Jabari was already chained in the hold of a ship with 40 other captives, sailing west toward a future he could not imagine. The journey lasted 11 weeks. Jabari never spoke of it in detail, not then and not later. History tells us what those voyages were like. Human beings packed into spaces meant for cargo, disease spreading rapidly, death rates reaching 30 or 40% before land was reached. Darkness, unbearable heat, and the constant sounds and smells of suffering compressed into a space too small to truly understand. What is known about Jabari's experience comes from fragments he later shared with people he trusted. He was kept separate from most of the captives, chained alone near the captain's quarters. This was because of his size, which frightened the crew, and because Heir viewed him as valuable cargo that had to arrive alive. He was fed better than the others and given water more often, not out of kindness, but because his body was expected to bring a high price once he reached American soil. Punctuation was allowed on deck at times, mostly for fresh air and light movement. Still, he used every small moment of relative freedom to observe. He watched how the ship functioned. He learned the patterns of the crew, when they changed shifts, when they slept, when they were sharp, and when they grew careless. He studied the sea, the stars above, and the wind and current patterns the sailors relied on to travel. He listened closely to conversations in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. He did not speak these languages, but over time he began to understand them through repetition and context. He was preparing for something he could not yet name, but he was preparing all the same. The ship reached Cuba in January of 1869. The captives were moved to a holding compound outside Havana. There they were washed, fed, and readied for sale. Jabari spent 3 weeks in that place, watched at all times by guards who had been warned about his size and the threat he might pose. The man who bought him was an American named Theodore Marsh. Marsh was a broker who supplied labor to plantations in Louisiana. He paid $400 for Jabari, double the usual price for a strong adult man, because Colonel Marcus Whitmore had specifically asked for an African of rare size and power. Whitmore had plans for such a man, plans he had explained clearly to Marsh during a meeting in New Orleans 2 months earlier. The colonel wanted a spectacle. Marcus Whitmore was 53 years old in 1869. He had been born into one of the richest families in Louisiana. He was the heir to a cotton fortune built across 3 generations by the labor of enslaved people. He had gone to West Point, served with honor in the Mexican-American War, and later became a colonel in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He never accepted the South's loss. He never accepted emancipation. He certainly never accepted the idea that the people who had worked his family's land for 100 years were now legally free to walk away. Whitmore's plantation, known as Bellamont, stretched across 12,000 acres along the banks of Bayou Lush. Before the war, more than 300 enslaved people had worked that land. After the war, the federal government ordered Whitmore to free them and either pay them wages or allow them to leave. Whitmore did neither. Instead, he built a system that kept slavery alive in all but name. Workers were told they owed money for housing, food, clothes, and tools. The debts were calculated so they could never truly be paid. Anyone who tried to leave was told they would be arrested for theft if they did not clear their account. Those who pushed further were visited at night by masked men who beat them, burned their homes, or made them vanish. The local sheriff was Whitmore's cousin. The local judge had served under him during the war. Federal officials meant to enforce Reconstruction laws were bribed, threatened, or simply ignored complaints because they lacked the power and resources to investigate abuse in a state where abuse was everywhere. By 1869, Whitmore had effectively rebuilt the plantation system of the Antebellum South, with 217 people living and working on his land under conditions no different from slavery. But control alone was not enough for Whitmore. He wanted to send a message. The war had humiliated him. The occupation had humiliated him. Seeing black men in Union uniforms, seeing former slaves vote and hold office, seeing the world turned upside down, all of it burned inside him like acid. He needed to prove, to himself and to others like him, that the natural order still stood, that white men were still masters, that black people were still animals to be used and thrown away. An African giant would serve that purpose perfectly. Whitmore imagined a creature from the jungle, savage and uncivilized, proof in his mind that black people were fundamentally different from whites, fundamentally inferior, naturally sweet. Only for hard labor and submission. He would show this creature to his friends. He would display his control over it, and when the novelty faded, he would hunt it. The hunt was the peak of his fantasy, a return to the old days when planters chased escaped slaves through swamps with dogs and guns, when the chase was sport and the capture was entertainment. Whitmore had taken part in such hunts before the war. He missed them. He wanted that thrill again, and he wanted to share it with others who felt the same way. Jabari arrived at Bellamont in February of 1869. He was brought from New Orleans in a caged wagon, the kind meant for dangerous animals. His wrists and ankles were chained. His neck was locked in an iron collar fastened to the bars of the cage. The trip lasted 2 days. During that time, Jabari watched the land pass by. He memorized landmarks. He noted the sun's path and the direction of water flowing in the streams they crossed. When the wagon reached Bellamont, a crowd was waiting. Whitmore had announced the arrival of his African giant. Every white person on the plantation and many from nearby estates had come to see it. Jabari was dragged from the cage and forced to stand in the yard before the main house. His chains were loosened just enough for him to walk, not to run. What little clothing he had left after the voyage was stripped away. He stood naked before the crowd. Whitmore walked around him like a man inspecting livestock. He pointed out Jabari's height, his muscle, the ritual scars on his chest that marked his family line. The crowd whispered and gasped. Some women turned away. Some men laughed and made crude jokes. Jabari did not move. His face showed nothing. His eyes moved slowly, studying faces and positions, storing details that might matter later. Whitmore stopped in front of him and looked up. The colonel was tall for his time, nearly 6 feet, but Jabari stood more than half a foot taller. "Do you understand English?" Whitmore asked. Jabari said nothing. "Can you speak at all, or do your kind just grunt like the apes you are?" Jabari remained silent. Whitmore smiled. This was what he expected. Savages from the deep jungle would not know civilized speech. That was part of the attraction. The total otherness of the creature, its distance from the world of educated white men. "Take him to the quarters," Whitmore said. "Chain him in the large cabin. I want 4 men watching him at all times. If he tries anything, shoot him in the legs. I want him alive, but I don't need him moving." The guards led Jabari away. The crowd broke apart, buzzing with talk, already spreading stories that would grow larger with each telling. The African giant had arrived. The show was about to start. What no one understood, what no one could have understood, was that the show had already begun, and the audience and the performer were not who they believed them to be. Jabari was locked in a cabin at the edge of the quarters. The building had NCE held a family of 6. Now it held only him and the guards watching him. It had 1 door and 2 barred windows. His ankle chain was fixed to a ring bolted into the floor, giving him about 10 feet of movement in any direction. For the first week he did nothing but watch. He studied the guards. He learned their names, their habits, their weak points. There were 12 men assigned to him, rotating in groups of 4. Within days he knew who drank while on duty, who fell asleep, who enjoyed cruelty, and who was simply earning a wage. He learned that shifts changed at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and that the 10 minutes during those changes were the only times when fewer than 4 men were present. He watched the other workers through the windows. He learned the rhythm of plantation life. He noted how people and supplies moved, where tools were kept, where overseers stood during the day, and where they went at night. He saw which paths were heavily used and which were ignored. He listened constantly. The guards spoke openly, believing he could not understand. They complained about money, about their treatment, about their wives and lovers. They gossiped about Whitmore and his plans, about nearby planters, about politics, about small worries that filled their days. They spoke about the workers using words that revealed relationships and tensions. Jabari stored it all away. Most important, they talked about the hunt. It was planned for August. Whitmore had already sent invitations to a dozen friends, wealthy planters, and former Confederate officers who shared his tastes. The African giant would be released into the swamp north of the plantation. He would be given a 1-hour head start. Then men on horseback, with dogs and rifles, would follow. The first man to kill the prey would win $500. The body would be displayed in New Orleans as proof of the savage nature of the African race. Jabari listened without any outward response. The guards took his silence as ignorance. They were wrong. During those first weeks, something else happened, something that would change everything. Jabari met the other workers. They were brought to his cabin in small groups by guards who wanted to show off the African giant or see how the enslaved people would react to a man from across the ocean. The workers looked at Jabari with expressions that ranged from fear to curiosity, slowly shifted into something that might once have been hope. One worker stood apart from the rest. His name was Solomon, and he was 63 years old. He had been born on Bellamont back when it still carried its old French name. He was raised under Whitmore's father and had survived more than 6 decades of slavery. Solomon had witnessed everything a place like that could show a man. He had seen families ripped apart, children torn from their mothers and sold away, men beaten until they no longer breathed over the smallest mistakes. He had lived long enough to lose 2 wives and 4 children. His wives died from exhaustion and sickness. His children were sold to faraway plantations, places from which no message ever returned. By any normal measure, Solomon should have been crushed. He should have been emptied of feeling, worn down into quiet obedience, shaped into exactly what the system demanded, but he was not. Something inside Solomon had endured. You could call it faith, or stubborn will, or simply the human refusal to fully give in to despair. Whatever it was, it still burned in his eyes. It was the same spark the overseers had once noticed in Jabari's gaze, the kind of spark that marked a person as dangerous. Solomon came to Jabari's cabin on the third night after the guards slipped into their usual careless routine. He stood outside the window, hidden by darkness, and spoke softly through the bars. "You understand, don't you?" he said. It was not really a question. Jabari turned and looked toward the sound of his voice. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I've seen that look before," Solomon went on. "I've seen it in men who were planning something, men who refused to accept what was being done to them." He paused. "Those men are all dead now. The ones who fought back, the ones who tried to run. Whitmore killed every one of them." Jabari remained silent. "But you are different," Solomon said. "I can feel it. You are not afraid. You are not even truly angry. You are thinking. You are waiting. You are planning." He stepped Ed closer to the bars and lowered his voice even more. "Whatever you are preparing, I want to help. We all want to help. Everyone here has been waiting for something, or someone, for a very long time. Maybe you are what we have been waiting for." Jabari studied the old man for a long while. Then, for the first time since he arrived at Bellamont, he spoke. "Tell me everything," he said. His English carried a heavy accent, but the words were clear. He had been listening since the day he arrived, learning through constant exposure, the same way he had learned Portuguese and Spanish aboard the ship. His mind, trained to track and analyze, had broken the language apart and rebuilt it around his own, creating a rough but useful understanding. Solomon stared at him, surprised for a moment. Then he smiled, the first real smile he had allowed himself in many years. "I will," he said. "I will tell you everything." Over the weeks that followed, Solomon became Jabari's main source of knowledge about Bellamont. He visited often, always at night, always when guards were distracted or asleep. He told Jabari everything he knew. He described the plantation's layout, the 12,000 acres stretching from the bayou to the swamp, the fields, forests and waterways cutting across the land. He explained where Whitmore lived with his wife and 2 sons, where the overseers slept, where the stables, kennels and armory were kept. He spoke about the people, the 217 workers held there against their will, their names, ages, skills and family ties. He told Jabari who could be trusted completely and who might give in under fear. He pointed out the natural leaders who had risen despite the system's efforts to crush all leadership, the men and women who kept hope alive through quiet words and small acts of resistance. He also spoke of Whitmore himself. He described the colonel's habits, his daily routines, his weaknesses. He spoke of Whitmore's dependence on laudanum, which he drank each night to sleep, and his violent temper that flared without warning and left people broken or dead. He spoke of Whitmore's arrogance, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else, that he had planned for every possibility, that no one could ever outthink him. And then Solomon spoke of the swamp. The swamp was the key. Whitmore planned to release Jabari into it for the hunt, convinced that and from the African jungle would be helpless in unfamiliar land, easy prey for men who believed they knew it well. Whitmore was wrong. Solomon described the swamp carefully. He had worked there as a young man, cutting cypress for lumber. He drew rough maps in the dirt outside the cabin window, showing water channels, islands, solid ground, and hidden death traps. He showed where a man could hide and where a man would sink and die. He explained which plants could be eaten, which would poison, which animals were truly dangerous, and which only appeared so. He taught Jabari how to navigate by the stars when water and trees erased all familiar markers. Jabari absorbed every detail. "The swamp is not so different from the jungle," he told Solomon one night. "Water, trees, predators. I have lived in places like this all my life. Whitmore thinks he is sending me into a trap. He is sending me home." Solomon nodded slowly. "Then you have a chance. But chance alone is not enough. There will be 12 men with guns and dogs. You will have nothing." "Perhaps," Jabari said, "if I am the prey. But what if I am the hunter?" Solomon looked at him, confused. Jabari continued, "I have killed leopards, lions, creatures faster and stronger than any man. I did not chase them. I did not fight them on their terms. I studied them. I learned their habits. I found their weaknesses. Then I made their strength work against them." He smiled, the first smile anyone at Bellamont had ever seen from him. Heir men believe they are hunters, and that I am prey. That belief is their weakness." Solomon asked how, and Jabari told him. The plan formed slowly through months of whispered talks and careful steps. It was complicated and required cooperation from people who had been taught since birth that resistance meant death. It demanded stolen supplies, hidden shelters, silent signals, and codes that would not draw attention. It also demanded patience, something that went against every instinct Jabari had as a hunter. The hunt was set for August. It was only March. 5 months of waiting, 5 months of humiliation, 5 months of pretending not to understand, while Whitmore and his men praised themselves for capturing what they called a perfect savage. Jabari waited as visitors came to stare at him, rich men and women who prodded him with canes and spoke about his body in ways they never would have dared with a white man. He waited as food was thrown to him like scraps, laughter following as he ate from the floor because his hands were restrained. He waited as Whitmore sat outside the cabin night after night, describing the hunt in detail, speaking of how Jabari would be chased, shot, skinned, and displayed. Through all of it, Jabari showed nothing. His face stayed empty. His eyes revealed only calm observation, which his captors mistook for emptiness. He played the role they expected, the broken beast too dull to understand his fate. Inside, he counted every day and prepared. Solemn. On was not his only ally. There was Ruth, who worked in the main house and knew schedules, keys, and weapons. There was Isaiah in the stables, who understood the horses and dogs and how they would react. There was Daniel, a young messenger who could move freely without suspicion. Each was tested carefully before being trusted. Each carried their own pain and reasons to fight. Jabari did not promise revenge. He promised freedom. The plan was bigger than survival. It was about breaking chains, freeing 217 people, and creating a chance that would never come again. The hunt would pull Whitmore and his guests away, deep into the swamp. While they chased what they thought was prey, the workers would act. Weapons would be taken. Guards left behind would be overcome. Supplies and animals would be gathered. Then they would leave, moving north toward Kansas, toward land where slavery had never taken root. It was a desperate plan. It demanded everything to work perfectly. It asked ordinary people to become fighters overnight, but it was also the only plan they had. And when Solomon shared the idea with the others, one by one, during quiet whispered meetings held deep in the night, not a single person said no. Every one of them agreed. They were ready to fight. In truth, they had been ready for a long time. What they lacked was not courage, but direction. They needed someone to show them a path. The months moved slowly. Jabari used every day wisely. He could not tray in the open, not with guards watching his every movement, but he found ways to keep his body strong even while bound by chains. He created a routine of isometric training, tightening and releasing his muscles against the resistance of his own body. No weights were needed. The strength grew quietly, hidden from careless eyes. He practiced moving inside the small 10-foot space he was allowed, teaching himself to step without sound and to control his breathing until even the wooden floor could not betray him. He trained his mind just as carefully. Each night, once the guards settled into their habits and the plantation grew quiet, Jabari closed his eyes and walked the swamp in his thoughts. Using Solomon's careful descriptions and the rough maps drawn in dirt, he built the land inside his head. The picture became so clear that he could move through it without seeing. He imagined the hunt again and again, changing angles, positions, and reactions. He planned for mistakes, for surprise, for moments where nothing went as expected and only instinct would matter. He remembered his father's lessons. A hunter does not simply kill. A hunter understands. He understands the land, the animal, and himself. He knows that patience is worth more than speed, and that intelligence matters more than raw strength. Victory does not belong to the fastest or the strongest, but to the one who can think clearly when chaos surrounds him. Jabari understood this truth deeply. He also understood something else, something his captors could never imagine. He was not alone. Word of the African giant had traveled through the hidden network that connected enslaved people across Louisiana. Messages moved quietly, from field to field and plantation to plantation. An underground line of whispers, coded songs, and small scraps of paper tucked into clothing. People Jabari would never meet knew his name. They knew about the hunt. They knew something was coming, and they helped however they could. Most help came in small pieces. A guard on a nearby plantation casually mentioned to his enslaved servant that Whitmore's dogs were trained to follow blood. A house worker in New Orleans overheard her master talking about the hunt and passed along details about who would attend and what weapons they planned to use. A boatman on the bayou shared information about water levels and currents that could change how someone moved through the swamp. Each detail reached Solomon, and Solomon found his way to Jabari's window in the darkness. By August, Jabari knew more about the hunt than many of the men taking part in it. He knew the names of the 12 men who would chase him. He knew their reputations, their habits, and their flaws. He knew which were skilled hunters and which were rich men chasing excitement. He knew who was truly dangerous and who was simply cruel. He knew Whitmore had ordered special ammunition, bullets meant to injure, not kill, designed to bring down the prey without ruining it. The colonel wanted his trophy alive if possible. He wanted the final moment for himself in front of witnesses who would spread the story across the South. Jabari knew the dogs, 6 mastiffs trained to hunt escaped slaves, would be released 30 minutes after he entered the swamp, giving him a head start before the real chase began. He knew the men would ride on horseback until the land became too rough, then continue on foot, spreading out to cover more ground. He knew they expected him to die within the first hour. They were wrong. The morning of August 14th arrived heavy and wet. The air was thick with moisture, so dense that breathing felt like sinking underwater. Jabari had been awake long before sunrise, running through the plan one last time, checking every step against months of preparation. At 7 o'clock, guards came to his cabin and removed his heavy chains. They replaced them with lighter restraints, a single rope tied around his wrists, easy to cut once the hunt began. They gave him clothing, rough cotton pants and a shirt, the first proper clothes he had worn since arriving at Bellamont. They handed him a water bottle and a knife. The knife surprised him. Whitmore believed that sport demanded giving the prey a chance to defend itself, however small. The blade was dull and the handle loose, nearly useless in a real fight. Jabari took it without comment. He had no plan to use it as a weapon. The knife had other purposes. They led him from the cabin across the plantation to the northern edge, where the worked land ended and the swamp began. A crowd waited there. Enslaved workers were forced to watch while white visitors gathered eagerly for entertainment. Whitmore stood at the front, dressed for the hunt, a rifle resting on his shoulder and a pleased smile on his face. "Today, gentlemen, we hunt the most dangerous game," he announced. "An African savage, fresh from the jungles of the Congo, armed only with his primitive instincts against the superior skills of civilized men." He paused, enjoying the moment. "I give him 1 hour before the dogs find him, 2 hours before he is brought down. Who wants to place a bet?" The crowd laughed. Coins and bills changed hands as men wagered on how long the hunt would last. Whitmore turned to Jabari. "Do you have anything to say, savage? Any last words before you run for your pathetic life?" Jabari looked at him. For the first time since arriving at Bellamont, he allowed something to show in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, something colder, contempt. "I will see you soon," he said. His English was clear and careful. Whitmore's smile flickered for a brief moment before returning. "So the beast can speak after all," he said. "How charming. It will make the trophy even finer when your head hangs on my wall." He waved to the guards. "Release him. Let the hunt begin." The rope around Jabari's wrists was cut. The crowd parted, forming a narrow path toward the swamp. Jabari walked forward slowly, on purpose, refusing to run like the frightened animal they expected. At the edge of the trees, he stopped and turned around. Every eye was on him. Workers, visitors, guards, and Whitmore himself all watched, waiting for him to disappear. Jabari lifted one hand and pointed directly at Whitmore. Then he stepped into the trees and was gone. The swamp closed around him. The moment Jabari entered the swamp, everything changed. On the plantation, he had been a captive, a display piece meant for cruel amusement. He had shuffled, stared, and acted the part they assigned him, hiding everything beneath the surface. Now he was home. Not this land exactly, but the world of water, trees, and shadow he had known since childhood. The rules were the same in the Congo jungle and the Louisiana bayou. Move quietly, stay hidden, use the land, think like prey to predict the hunter, think like a hunter to become something worse. Jabari moved through the swamp with speed and silence that would have shocked any observer. His bare feet found firm ground where others would sink. His body slipped through narrow gaps that looked impossible for a man his size. In 10 minutes he had traveled half a mile. In 20 he reached the first location Solomon had described, a small rise of dry ground surrounded by deep, dark water, too thick for horses and too confusing for dogs to track. He stopped and began to prepare. The knife was useless for fighting, but that was never its purpose. He used it to tear strips from his shirt, twisting them into rough cords for simple snares. He sharpened sticks into points and hid them in the mud along narrow approaches. He cut vines for later use. As he worked, he listened. The swamp spoke constantly. Birds called, insects hummed, frogs croaked, and water splashed softly through hidden channels. Beneath those sounds, Jabari heard others, distant dogs barking, men shouting, the noise of hunters who believed nothing could threaten them, who felt no need for silence. They were coming. 30 minutes had passed. The dogs would be searching now, following the scent he had left behind. Jabari smiled. He had given them a trail, leading deep into unstable ground where water swallowed paths and time was wasted. While they struggled forward, Jabari would move around behind them. But that was only the first layer. The real work had been done long before, in whispered talks through cabin windows, in supplies hidden throughout the swamp, and in knowledge gathered from Solomon, Isaiah, and many others. Jabari was not running. He was hunting. The first man died at 11:43 in the morning. His name was Robert Callahan. He was 41 years old, a plantation owner from Ascension Parish who had joined the hunt out of boredom and a hunger for excitement. He had once served as a Confederate cavalry officer during the war, a role that made him believe deeply in his own military skill, even though he had never actually taken a life in battle. He rode a well-bred horse, carried a costly rifle, and wore clothes made especially for the hunt. He also had a habit of riding ahead of the others, always eager to be the first to see the prey, imagining the honor of being the man who brought down the African giant. That habit was what led to his death. Jabari had placed himself high in a cypress tree overlooking one of the main water channels, completely hidden among the Spanish moss hanging from the branches. He watched the hunting party enter the swamp, studied how they moved, noticed which riders stayed close together and which drifted away from the group. Callahan stood out immediately as the best target. When the man passed beneath the tree, Jabari dropped down. The fall was not very far, maybe 12 feet, but Jabari used the full distance to his advantage. He landed hard on Callahan's back, knocking him from the saddle and sending both of them into the shallow water below. The force stunned Callahan, drove the air from his chest, and gave Jabari the brief moment he needed. One hand pressed tightly over Callahan's mouth. The other grabbed the knife from the man's belt, a proper hunting blade, sharp and heavy in the hand. Jabari cut Callahan's throat before he could make a sound. The horse, terrified by the sudden attack, ran wildly down the channel. The noise would attract attention, but by then Jabari would already be gone, taking Callahan's rifle, his ammunition, his knife, and his water canteen. He left the body floating, face down in the water, as a warning to whoever found it. The prey could fight back. The second man died at 1:15 in the afternoon. His name was James Thornton. He was 37 years old, a lawyer from Baton Rouge, and he had no reason to be on any hunt at all. He was heavy, unfit, deeply afraid of the swamp, and only there because his father-in-law, one of Whitmore's closest friends, had pushed him to come and prove himself. Thornton became separated when his horse refused to cross a deep stretch of water. While he struggled with the animal, shouting for help that never came, Jabari rose from the water behind him like something out of a nightmare. Thornton never saw his killer. He felt a hand grip his ankle, felt himself yanked from the saddle, and then felt the water close over his head. He fought for a few moments before losing consciousness. He never woke again. Jabari held him under until the bubbles stopped rising, then let the body drift away. He took Thornton's pistol, a Colt Navy revolver loaded with 6 rounds, and vanished back into the swamp. The hunting party found Thornton's body 40 minutes later, caught in tree roots along the edge of a channel. The discovery changed everything. This was no longer a game or a sport. This had become war. Whitmore gathered the men who remained on a stretch of higher ground and considered their situation. 2 men were dead. both killed quietly and efficiently, their weapons taken. The dogs were confused, running in circles, unable to follow a scent through the water and mud. The horses were restless, reacting to the fear of their riders and becoming harder to manage. Some of the hunters wanted to quit and go home. This was not what they had agreed to. They expected a chase, a staged kill, a trophy to boast about later. Not this. Not real danger. Not the chance that they themselves might die. Whitmore refused to consider retreat. He said the man was alone, just one savage armed with stolen weapons. They were 12 trained men with better guns. They did not run from animals, they hunted them and killed them. Someone reminded him that 2 men were already dead. Whitmore dismissed it, saying it had been done through tricks and ambush, the kind of cleverness any wild beast could manage. His eyes searched the swamp for movement. He said the man would not face them directly because he knew he would lose, so they would force him out. They would spread out, close in from every direction, leave him nowhere to escape, and when they cornered him, they would put him down like a dog. The plan made sense from a military point of view and might have worked against a normal enemy. But Whitmore was not facing a normal enemy. He was fighting a man who had killed lions by learning how they thought, who had survived capture by understanding the minds of his captors, and who understood men far better than they understood him. The hunters spread out as ordered, forming a wide circle that slowly tightened toward the sea. Enter of the swamp. They moved carefully, watching for traps, calling out to each other to stay connected. The dogs ran ahead, still searching, still unable to follow a clear trail. Jabari watched them from a hidden place 300 yards away. He had expected this move. He had planned for it and knew exactly how to respond. The third man died at 3:47 in the afternoon. His name was William Prescott. He was the most dangerous of the hunters, a former Confederate sharpshooter who had killed more than 30 Union soldiers during the war. Prescott was steady, skilled, and experienced with his rifle. If anyone could spot Jabari first, it was him. That was why Jabari killed him before anyone else. He shot him from a distance using Callahan's rifle, firing from cover across a channel too wide for anyone to return accurate fire. The bullet struck Prescott in the chest and killed him instantly. By the time the others reached the body, Jabari was already a quarter-mile away, moving through water too shallow for horses to follow. 3 men dead in 3 hours. The numbers were impossible to ignore. At 4:30, 2 of the remaining hunters announced they were leaving. They had come for excitement, not to die. They would rather risk the swamp than stay in a hunt that had turned into a massacre. Whitmore allowed them to go. He could not force them to stay, and their fear was spreading, weakening the resolve of the others. It was better to let the frightened men leave than to have them pan. I see when it mattered most. 7 hunters were left. Whitmore, his 2 sons, and 4 others who were either too proud or too foolish to walk away. The sun was dropping low. Within an hour, darkness would cover the swamp, and in the dark, every advantage would belong to the hunted man. The hunters carried lanterns, but lantern light could be seen from far away, revealing their positions while keeping their enemy hidden. Whitmore decided they would camp for the night. He ordered fires built and a perimeter set, with 2 men on watch at all times. They would resume the hunt in the morning with rested bodies and clear minds. It was a sensible choice and exactly what Jabari had expected. They made camp on a small island, the largest piece of dry land nearby. Fires were lit to keep away insects and night animals. Guards were posted at opposite ends. The men ate cold food, drank from their canteens, and tried not to think about the 3 bodies floating somewhere in the dark water. Jabari watched from the trees 60 yards away, hidden in the shadows that felt like home to him. He ate food taken from one of Solomon's supply caches set months earlier. He rested briefly in a shelter no one would ever find. He was ready for what would come next, but first there was other work to be done. At 11 that night, while the hunters stayed close to their fires and startled at every sound, something else was happening at Belmont. Solomon had waited months for this moment. He had replayed it in his mind again and again, planned every step, prepared for mistakes and disasters. When the signal came, a lantern flashed 3 times from the tree line, and he moved. The armory was guarded by 2 overseers left behind when Whitmore took most of the force to the hunt. They were drinking whiskey and playing cards, confident that the workers would never fight back. They believed fear had crushed any resistance long ago. Solomon approached them openly, moving slowly, head lowered, wearing the look of submission they expected. He told them there was an urgent message from the main house about the hunt. Annoyed but unconcerned, they allowed him to come closer. When he was within arm's reach, Isaiah entered through the back door. Isaiah was 43 and had worked in the stables since childhood. He knew every horse, how to calm them, how to stir them, and how to move quietly among powerful animals. He also knew how to move silently among men. He carried a hammer taken from the blacksmith's shed. The first guard died before he understood what was happening. The second shouted once before Solomon crushed his throat. The noise brought others running, workers who had been waiting in hiding. They flooded the armory and secured the weapons. Within 15 minutes, the remaining guards at Belmont were dealt with. Some were killed. Others were locked inside the same cabins that had once held enslaved people. No one escaped to warn Whitmore, Ruth, who had worked in the main house. For 20 years, led a group to take control of Whitmore's wife and sons. The wife, Elizabeth, a weak woman who had never shown kindness to the workers, fainted when armed black men entered her bedroom. The sons, still teenagers, full of their father's arrogance but lacking his courage, surrendered immediately. By midnight, Belmont was no longer under Whitmore's control. It belonged to the people who had worked it all their lives. Solomon called everyone together in the open yard in front of the main house, all 217 people who had spent their whole lives under the rule of the Whitmore family. He studied their faces and saw fear, hope, and disbelief all mixed together. Then he told them what would happen next. "We are leaving," he said. "Every one of us. Tonight. We are going north to Kansas, where free people have built towns that welcome people like us." He stopped for a moment so the words could settle in their minds. "It is a long trip, 500 miles, maybe more. There will be danger at every step, but I would rather die free on that road than live one more day under any white man's boot." He asked if anyone wanted to stay behind. Not a single person stepped forward. They took everything they could carry: food from the storehouses, clothes from the main house, weapons from the armory, horses and mules from the stables. Wagons were filled with supplies meant to last for weeks. They gathered the children who were too young to understand what was happening, and the elders who were too old to move fast but would never be abandoned. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the journey began. They moved northwest, following routes Solomon had planned months earlier. These paths avoided main roads and white settlements, winding through forests and along rivers that could hide them. They traveled as fast as they could with wagons, animals, and people of every age, knowing that every hour mattered and that pursuit would come sooner or later. Behind them, Belmont burned. Ruth had suggested it, and Solomon had agreed. The main house, the overseer's quarters, the gin and the presses, everything that showed Whitmore's power and wealth, was left to the flames. Let him come back to ashes. Let him see that his world was gone, destroyed by the people he had called animals. The fire rose high into the night sky, visible for miles, a signal that something had changed forever and could never be undone. Out in the swamp, Jabari saw the glow on the horizon. He smiled. The first phase was finished. Now the second phase would begin. The hunters woke to the smell of smoke. At first, they thought it came from their own fires fading in the early morning darkness. Then someone looked south and saw the orange light. Panic rushed through the camp like a sickness. "That's Belmont," Whitmore said, his voice empty. "That's my home." He wanted to leave at once and race back to the plantation to save whatever he could. But the swamp lay between him and home, miles of dangerous land. That had already taken the lives of 3 men. And somewhere in that swamp the African giant was waiting. They argued. Some wanted to turn back right away. Some wanted to keep hunting the savage who had caused all this, just to claim one victory from the disaster. Others suggested splitting up, with half going home and half staying. In the end, they made the worst choice possible. They waited. While they argued and debated and failed to decide, Jabari moved. During the night he had repositioned himself, circling to the south side of their camp and placing himself between the hunters and the route back home. He had prepared the land, setting obstacles to slow pursuit and marking fallback positions in case things went wrong. He was ready. The 4th man died at 6:12 in the morning, just as sunlight began to slip through the cypress trees. His name was Thomas Whitmore, the colonel's oldest son, 23 years old, heir to everything his father owned. He died trying to prove himself, trying to spot the enemy who had killed his friends, trying to become the hero his father wanted him to be. Jabari shot him from 40 yards away, a clean shot straight through the heart. Thomas fell into the water and never came back up. The colonel screamed. It was a sound Jabari would remember for the rest of his life, a sound filled with pure pain, the cry of a father watching his son die. For a brief moment, just one moment, Jabari felt something like pity. Whitmore was a monster, but even monsters could love their children and feel pain when they lost them. Then Jabari remembered Amara, his own sister, threatened with a knife by men like Whitmore, men who saw other human beings as animals to be used and thrown away. He remembered the ship, the darkness, the sound of chained people dying. He remembered every insult, every beating, every cruelty at Belmont, and every suffering he had seen others endure. The pity vanished. "Colonel," Jabari's voice echoed through the swamp, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Your son is dead. Your home is burning. Your slaves are free." He paused so each sentence could land like a strike. "Come and face me, man to man, hunter to hunter, or run home and find only ashes." Whitmore's reply was a wild stream of curses and threats, full of rage but empty of meaning. Jabari watched him move, pushing through the water toward the sound of the voice, rifle raised, eyes burning with grief and anger. The other hunters tried to follow, but Jabari had planned for this. Fallen trees and hidden channels broke their formation and separated Whitmore from his men, guiding him toward a single place, a small island clearing where Jabari waited. They stood facing each other across 20 feet of muddy ground. Whitmore looked like a man who had lost everything. His clothes were torn and soaked. His face was scratched by branches he had forced his way through. His eyes were red from crying and sleeplessness, locked onto Jabari with a hatred so strong it seemed to twist the air between them. Jabari looked exactly like what he was, a hunter, a warrior, a man shaped by fire and made stronger by it. "You think you've won," Whitmore said. His voice was calm now, cold, the voice of a man who had accepted death and no longer feared it. "You killed my son. You burned my home. You think that makes you the winner?" "No," Jabari replied. "I think it makes us even." Whitmore laughed, a hollow sound without joy. "You think my son's life equals the lives of animals? You think your weak revenge balances anything?" "I think," Jabari said slowly, "that you are going to die in this swamp, and when you die, you will know that everything you believed was a lie. You are not superior. You are not civilized. You are a small man with a loud voice, and the world will forget you ever lived within one generation." Whitmore raised his rifle, but Jabari was faster. He had dropped his own rifle minutes earlier, knowing this moment would come and wanting to finish it differently. He crossed the 20 feet before Whitmore could aim, crashed into him with full force, and drove him into the mud. The rifle fired harmlessly into the air. They fought. Whitmore was not weak, not old, and not new to violence. He had killed men in war and in peace. Now he fought with the wild strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. But Jabari was stronger, quicker, and better trained. He had faced lions and leopards, beasts that could kill a man in seconds, and survived. Whitmore, for all his cruelty, was only a man. The fight ended in less than a minute. Whitmore lay on his back in the mud, Jabari's knee pressed into his chest. Jabari's hands locked around his throat. The colonel's face turned dark and swollen. His eyes bulged as his hands scratched uselessly at Jabari's arms. Jabari leaned in close. "I could kill you now," he said. "I should kill you. For your son, for the people you enslaved, for everything you have done." He tightened his grip and watched Whitmore's eyes begin to fade. "But death is too easy for you. Death is escape. I want you to live." He let go. Whitmore gasped and choked, dragging air back into his lungs. He tried to speak, but his throat was too damaged. "I want you to live," Jabari said again, "so you can see what comes next. Your slaves are gone. Your home is ash. Your son is dead. Your wealth, your power, your precious white superiority, all of it is gone. And you will spend the rest of your miserable life knowing it was taken from you by the people you called animals." He stood and looked down at the broken man in the mud. "That is my revenge." Jabari turned and walked away. The remaining hunters found their leader an hour later, alive but ruined. His second son had survived the night, along with 4 other men. They carried Whitmore out of the swamp on a rough stretcher, a journey that took most of the day. When they reached Belmont, they found exactly what Jabari had promised: ashes. The main house was gone, nothing left but a black shell. The outbuildings, the stables, the gin, the presses, all destroyed. The cabins where the workers had lived still stood, empty now, silent markers of a system that had died. There were no workers, no animals, no supplies. Nothing remained but loss and emptiness, a hollow space where Whitmore's empire had once stood. The colonel was taken to a hospital in New Orleans. Doctors treated his wounds and listened to his broken story about an African giant who ruled wolves and spirits and destroyed everything with strange power. They believed grief had driven him mad. Maybe it had. By then, Jabari had already rejoined the Exodus. On the second day of the journey, he appeared from the forest like a ghost and caught up with Solomon and the others. The children screamed when they saw him. The adults reached for weapons until they recognized his face. Solomon hugged him like a son. "It's finished," Jabari said. "Whitmore lives, but he is broken. He will not follow. 4 of the others are dead. The rest ran." He paused, remembering the colonel's eldest son. His older son died. "I killed him." Solomon nodded slowly. He offered no judgment and no comfort. He understood that war was war, that the death of an enemy's child was a tragedy but not a crime, and that Jabari had done what was needed so others could be free. "Then we keep moving," Solomon said. "We still have a long road ahead." They kept going. The trip to Kansas lasted 43 days. It was the hardest thing any of them had ever faced. It was harder than the crushing work in the fields, harder than the beatings and the hunger, harder than anything they had known in lives already full of pain. They walked through thick forests and dark swamps, crossed rivers and wide prairies, and passed through land that was sometimes welcoming but more often dangerous. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day, staying away from roads and towns where white faces could mean capture or death. They lost people along the way. An elderly woman named Martha died on the 12th day when her heart failed during a difficult river crossing. A young man named Peter was shot by a farmer after being caught stealing corn from a field. A small child, a little girl no older than 3, fell ill with a fever that no medicine could heal. Every death cut deep, every loss reminded them of the heavy price of the journey. Still, they kept moving forward. Jabari became their guard, their guide, and their provider. He moved ahead of the group, watching for danger, finding safe routes, and hunting animals to add to their shrinking food supplies. He taught the younger men what he knew about tracking, stalking, and surviving in the wild. This knowledge had been passed down through his family for generations, and now it was taking root in American soil. He also learned. He learned proper English beyond the broken version he had picked. Up at Belmont, he learned about America, its history and its geography, and the painful contradictions that shaped it. It was a nation built on freedom that had enslaved millions, a democracy that had denied humanity to people because of their skin color. He learned about the war that was said to have ended slavery, about Reconstruction that was meant to rebuild the South, and about the countless ways white Americans managed to hold on to power even after losing the war. He also learned about the people traveling beside him. He learned their names and their stories, their dreams and their fears, their strengths and their flaws. He learned that Solomon had once been a preacher who led secret worship services in the quarters and kept faith alive among people who had every reason to give up. He learned that Ruth had been born free in Philadelphia, kidnapped at 16, and sold into slavery, spending 20 years dreaming of escape. He learned that Isaiah's grandfather had been African and had told stories of the homeland that Isaiah memorized and shared with others. It was a chain of memory linking Louisiana to the Congo across 200 years of separation. They became his people, not through blood, but through something stronger. They were bound by shared struggle, shared sacrifice, and the simple truth that they had survived together what should not have been survivable. On the 43rd day, they crossed into Kansas. The town was called Nicodemus. It had been founded 2 years earlier by formerly enslaved people from Kentucky who believed Kansas was a place where black people could own land and govern themselves. By 1869, the town had about 300 residents spread across hundreds of acres of prairie that they were slowly turning into farms. The arrival of 217 refugees from Louisiana overwhelmed the town. There was not enough housing, not enough food, not enough of anything to handle so many new arrivals. But the people of Nicodemus did what they could. They shared what little they had. They built shelters. They found ways to feed everyone until the newcomers could begin building lives of their own. Jabari was offered a place in the community, but he refused.